Welcome children in SB Union High School and Junior College Pune. We were learning about Std-IX English 2.4 lesson, The Fall of Troy. We have already learned part 1. So let's begin with part 2. Let's begin with the first paragraph. At last Troy was taken, not by force, but by a trick. It was the cunning Odysseus who thought of a plan to obtain the victory. Let us build a great wooden horse, he said, big enough to hold men inside it, and let some of our best fighters hide in the horse. Then let us burn our tents and pretend to sail away in our ships. But instead of sailing away, we will return in the night when the Trojans are asleep. We will attack the city and burn and kill. So children, however, in the 10th year, the site of Troy was captured by the Greeks, not by war, but with a clever trick. Odysseus, a great king and warrior, he devised a plan to take over Troy. The Greeks built a great wooden horse which could fit in many Greek soldiers. Once the horse was made, many Greek warriors, including Odysseus and Menelaus, got inside it, and the horse was then shut. At night, see what happens. Let's read next paragraph. The Greek leaders decided to follow the advice of the wise Odysseus. So a great horse of wood was made by a skillful engineer, and the greatest heroes, Menelaus, Odysseus himself, and others entered it. The last man to go in being the architect himself, who knew the secret of opening and shutting the entrance. That evening, the Greeks burnt their tents. They sailed away in their ships. But they did not go very far. Only one man was left behind to persuade the Trojans to drag the horse into the city. So children, we must know that once the horse was made, many Greek warriors, including Odysseus, Menelaus, they got inside it, and the horse was then shut. At night, the Greek soldiers set fire to their tents, and they set sail for an island nearby. But what happens next? We will read next paragraph and then we will learn about it. Next day, the Trojans woke up, expecting to go out and fight as they had done for the past 10 years. What delight and surprise they felt at the sight they saw on the seashore outside the walls. It seemed that the long siege was over at last. The tents had been burnt and the shore was deserted. The Greek ships had all gone. It's a peace at last, they cried, and opened wide their gates and came out in large numbers on the plain, glad to be free again to go wherever they pleased. Then they saw on the sands the huge wooden horse. They gathered round it in an astonishment, but for it was indeed a wonderful piece of work. As they were wondering how the horse had been built and why it had been left behind, they found a Greek with his hands tied together lying under it. When the Trojans dragged him out, the man pretended to be very frightened of them. When he was commanded to tell them why the Greeks had gone and why they had left this horse behind, he pretended to tremble very much and refused to speak. When at last they threatened to kill him, he spoke and he told them this false tale. So at night, the Greek soldiers set fire to their tents and they set sail for an island nearby where they could hide. Next morning, when the Trojan soldiers came to the battlefield, they saw, to their astonishment, that the Greeks were gone and only a large wooden horse was left on the seashore. They saw a Greek soldier tied up beneath the horse. They forced him to tell the truth. They forced him to tell what exactly had happened. But this person pretended to tremble very much. First, initially, he refused to speak, but when he was threatened to Kill! To be killed. He spoke, but he spoke and told the false story. Let's read next paragraph. So the Greek told them this false tale. The Greeks are tired of the long war and have sailed away in their ships, he said. But they are afraid of the long voyage home too. And so they have made this horse and left it as an offering to the god of the sea. They wanted also to kill me and offer me as a sacrifice to the sea god. But I escaped and hid from them. But why did the Greeks make such a huge horse? Some of the Trojans asked. And the cunning Greek made this reply. He said, if they had made a smaller offering, you might have taken it into your city. Then the luck would have gone to the Trojans and not to the Greeks. That is why they made it too big to go inside your gates. So, this way, when he was threatened, he started telling the false story. He cunningly told them that the Greeks were tired of the long war and they wanted to go back home. In order to have a peaceful voyage back home, they had made this horse as an offering to the god of the sea. And on being asked why the horse was so humongous in size, so huge in size, he replied that only if the horse stayed outside Troy, that means if the horse stayed outside Troy, it would be favorable for the Greeks, and that is why it was made huge so that it wouldn't be dragged into the city. The Trojans were delighted to hear this. The Greeks have gone, they said, and the walls are no longer necessary. Let us make a hole in the wall and drag the horse in. Their wise priest warned them not to do so. It may be a trick that will ruin us. He said, you will bring disaster on the city if you break down the walls. But they were so excited that they paid no attention to his words. They broke down part of their strong wall in order to drag the horse in. All the day the Trojans feasted and drank and celebrated. After all their celebrations, they went to sleep and slept soundly. But that day of rejoicing was soon followed by a night of terror and death. So the Trojans thought that they would break a part of the wall and drag the horse inside the city to bring misfortune to the Greeks. Despite the warning of their priest, they dragged the horse inside the city. And that night they rejoiced in their victory and went to bed peacefully. But they didn't know that that day of rejoicing would soon follow into a night of terror and death. In the darkness, the fleet sailed back, and the leading ship, which was Agamemnon's, bore a red light high on its mast. The Greek, who was watching for the return of the fleet, crept to the wooden horse and gave the signal. The side of the horse opened. The Greeks climbed out and opened the gates. The whole Greek army entered the sleeping city. Immediately, the Greeks set fire to the houses, towers, and palaces and began to burn and kill. Children, who was Agamemnon? He was a king of Mycenae and also a brother of Menelaus. He was a leader of the Greeks in the Trojan War. So here, in the darkness, the whole fleet sailed back, and the whole fleet was led by Agamemnon, the Greek who was watching for the return of the fleet. He crept to the wooden horse slowly and he gave the signal. Slowly the sides of the horse were opened and the Greeks climbed out. Those Greek soldiers who were hidden into the horse, they climbed out and they opened the gates. Now all the Greek soldiers, rather the whole Greek army, entered into the city which was sleeping, which was fast asleep. And immediately the Greeks set fire to houses, towers, and palaces, and the whole Trojan city began to burn and kill. The old epic city of Troy was burnt to the ground. Its soldiers, warriors, and kings were killed mercilessly. Troy was filled with the sight of leaping flames, and the sound of shouting, and the noise of weapons, and the cries of weeping women. The sleeping Trojans sprang out of their beds, but they were taken by surprise. Their enemies were right inside their walls, and many of the Trojans were killed before they could put on their armor and seize their weapons. A bright light lit up the night sky as palaces, houses, temples, and towers went up in flames. The Trojans fought as well as they could, but it was all in vain. Old King Priam was killed with all his brave sons. Hector's wife and his old mother and sister were carried off as slaves by the conquerors. Their fate was in contrast to Helen's when King Menelaus rushed through the city, looking for her, and found her in her palace. She hung her head in shame and sorrow as she faced her former husband. Her voice was choked with emotion and she could not speak. But Menelaus forgave her and she went back with him. For it was only Aphrodite who had turned her heart away from her home and her husband and her child. When morning came, nothing was left of the proud, rich city that had resisted attack for 10 years. The epic Iliad portrays this battle between the ancient kingdoms of Troy, at present, which is known as Turkey, and Sparta in Greece. While visiting Spartan king Menelaus, Trojan prince Paris falls for Menelaus's wife, Helen, and takes her back to Troy. Menelaus's brother, King Agamemnon, having already defeated every army in Greece, uses his brother's fury as a pretext to declare war against Troy and the last kingdom preventing his control over the Aegean Sea. How the Greek army finally cheats and wins over the Trojans forms the climax of the story. So, children, here we learn the whole lesson. 2 parts are over.